Clara, May Whitcomb took the dead roses out of her shop window, one stem at a time, because if she gathered them by the handful, the thorns caught in her sleeves and tore little white threads from the cuffs. The landlord had already changed the lock on the back door. The front key still worked until 5 o'clock, a mercy written into the lease by someone who had never stood inside an empty flower shop with a broom, a cardboard box, and $186 folded inside a bank envelope. The roses had been red when she bought them wholesale on credit. Now the heads drooped like old velvet soaked in tea. She laid them on yesterday's newspaper, stripped the leaves, and tried not to count what each bundle had cost. The cooler hummed behind her, with nothing inside but 3 mason jars, a coil of green florist tape, and the white funeral ribbon she had not been able to throw away after her mother's service. On the counter lay her mother's brass pruning shears. They were small, heavier than they looked, with one nick on the lower blade from the year Clara had tried to cut picture wire with them. Her mother had laughed then, not because the mistake was funny, but because Clara had looked so wounded by doing a thing badly. "Tools forgive you," her mother had said, taking the shears back and oiling the hinge. "People are the ones who make a ceremony out of mistakes." Clara wrapped the shears in a dish towel and put them in the pocket of her faded olive work jacket. At 4:42 she swept soil from beneath the display table. At 4:53 she turned the painted sign in the window from open to the blank gray back. At 4:59 she stood beneath the bell over the door and listened to the store breathe in its last-minute glass cooler. Street tires through rain, the tiny drip in the sink she had meant to fix before February became the month everything closed. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. When Clara stepped onto the sidewalk, the landlord waited beside his truck with a paper cup of coffee and the strained kindness of a man trying not to be cruel in public. He was older than her father would have been, and that made it worse. "I'm sorry, Clara," he said. She handed him the key. "I know. You did good work here. Good work." 2 words people gave you when they could not give you rent time or a way back. Clara nodded because he meant well. Then she lifted the cardboard box from the threshold, set it in the passenger seat of her 12-year-old hatchback, and drove without choosing a direction until the old flower shop disappeared behind the wet shine of downtown glass. Her phone rang near the edge of town. She let it ring twice because she expected another creditor, then looked at the screen and saw a county number from Lynn County, Oregon. For one tired second she thought of ignoring it. She had no account left for surprises. Clara Whitcomb, a woman asked. "Yes, this is Helen Armitage. I retired from the county clerk's office last year, but I'm helping clear some old nuisance property files. I'm calling about a structure on Willow Road." Clara pulled into the parking lot of a closed diner. Rain ticked against the windshield in fine silver threads. "I don't own a structure on Willow Road." "No," Helen said. "Not yet." The sentence sat there too strange to answer. Helen cleared her throat. "It's an abandoned glass greenhouse outside Alder Creek. Been vacant for decades. The county can order demolition this spring unless someone assumes responsibility and begins cleanup. There's an old conditional maintenance note attached to the file. Your grandmother's name appears in it." Clara looked down at the box on the seat. The funeral ribbon had slipped loose from one corner like a white tongue. "My grandmother, Elsie. Elsie Whitcomb, yes. She died before I was born." "I understand. But the note lists Elsie Whitcomb and any direct family willing to maintain the nursery structure for horticultural use. It's unusual. Most of these old papers don't matter anymore, but this one was recorded with the property transfer history. The current estate has abandoned it. The county can transfer it for $1, but the cleanup compliance deadline would become yours." Clara almost laughed, but there was no air in her for it. "Ma'am, I just closed my business today." Helen was quiet long enough that Clara heard a truck pass on the road, water hissing under its tires. "I'm sorry," Helen said. "I almost didn't call. But your grandmother's name was handwritten in the margin." "I thought someone ought to be asked before the glass came down." Glass came down. Clara pictured a bulldozer nudging a wall of old panes into glittering ruin. She had spent her adult life arranging stems under glass cooler doors, coaxing tulips open, trimming lilies before they bruised. She had lost the shop anyway. The idea of accepting another failing place should have felt absurd. Instead, it felt like being offered a chair in a room where she had been standing too long. She met Helen the next morning under a low February sky the color of pewter. Alder Creek was not much more than a post office, a feed store, a church with a reader board, and a line of wet firs bending over the road. Willow Road ran beyond it narrow and patched past empty berry fields and old farmhouses set back behind mossy fences. Helen drove a blue sedan and wore a raincoat buttoned wrong at the top. She handed Clara a clipboard, a county envelope, and a key with a paper tag so faded the ink had become a ghost. "I need to say plainly," Helen told her, "this is not a gift in the storybook sense. It's a liability unless you make progress. Broken glass, rot, possible pests. Maybe a bad flu. The county gives 90 days before review." "I have $186, Clara said. Helen studied her, then looked toward the lane across the road. "Then don't promise more than a first look." The lane had nearly vanished under blackberry canes. Clara pushed through with her box, balanced against her hip and her mother's shears in her jacket pocket. Thorns dragged at her jeans. Wet grass soaked through the seams of her boots. 50 yards and the greenhouse appeared between two leaning alders. It was longer than she expected, a narrow cathedral of wavy glass and black iron ribs crouched on a low brick wall gone dark with moss. Whole sections of the west side had collapsed inward. The ridge vent sagged open like a broken spine. Ferns grew from the gutters. The attached potting shed had a roof dipped low in the middle and its door hung by one hinge rubbing the threshold each time the wind moved it. Still, even ruined, the place held a shape that made Clara stop walking. The old panes did not reflect the morning cleanly. They bent it. The gray sky wavered and each rectangle fractured and softened, so the whole greenhouse seemed to be remembering daylight instead of receiving it. Beneath the damp smell of leaves and rotted wood, Clara caught a faint mineral scent, brick soil, old water asleep in pipes. Helen stayed several steps behind her. The original nursery grew winter flowers. Violets, camellias, things for town occasions. That's what the file says. Town occasions, funerals, church arrangements, hospital rooms. I don't know the full story. Clara put her hand on the front door. The wood was swollen, the latch rusted, the glass above it starred with cracks. Through the doorway she could see overturned clay pots, slate benches green with algae, and the central aisle carpeted in last autumn's leaves. It was not safe. Anyone could see that. The right thing was to walk away, let the county flatten it, and save herself from inheriting another failure with a pretty name. Then the clouds shifted. A pale blade of sun broke through the firs and touched the east wall. Condensation silvered most of the glass, cold and beaded. But one pane near the middle, just above the brick knee wall, cleared from the center outward, while Clara watched. The mist pulled back in a soft oval, leaving the glass bright and dry. "That's odd," Helen said. Clara stepped closer. The surrounding panes stayed fogged. The metal ribs stayed wet. Frost clung along the lower edge where the brick met the grass. But that single pane looked as if someone had breathed warmth from inside. "There isn't power here, is there?" Clara asked. "Not for years. Heat. None that works. The furnace room is in back, but the county notes call it inactive." Clara took off one glove. Her fingers were already stiff from the damp. She reached toward the cleared pane slowly, expecting ordinary cold glass. Warmth met her palm. Not hot, not alarming. Just a steady living warmth like a mug held too long after tea had cooled. Clara did not move. Her hand rested against the glass while the ruined greenhouse stood silent around her, every other pane filmed. Still, she kept her palm there. For the first time in weeks, something on the other side of glass had answered her touch. Clara came back the next morning with a roll of contractor bags, a borrowed flashlight, and the kind of breakfast a person bought when she did not want to admit she was counting coins. Gas station coffee, 1 banana, 2 packets of crackers tucked into her jacket pocket for later. The rain had stopped before dawn, but the field along Willow Road still held it. Each step pressed water up around her boots. She unlocked the gate chain. Helen had given her permission to use and cut the first blackberry cane at knee height. Her mother's shears made a clean, familiar bite. The cane sprang back, stippled with thorns, and left a red scratch across Clara's wrist. She did not wipe it. She cut another, then another, making a narrow passage through the growth until the greenhouse door stood in front of her like the entrance to a place that had been waiting without patience. The swollen door would not open at first. She set her shoulder to it, felt the frame shudder, and stopped. The glass above the latch had a long crack running from corner to corner. If she forced it, the pane might fall straight onto her hands. She crouched, scraped moss from the threshold with a flat stone, then pulled instead of pushed. The bottom edge dragged across old grit. The door opened 6 inches, then 12, breathing out the smell of wet leaves, cold. Soil and clay pots left too long in the dark. Inside, the central aisle was still visible beneath the debris. Slate benches ran along both sides, some tipped, some broken, their surfaces filmed green. A cast-iron rib arched above her head, black with rust at the joints but still graceful. The west wall was the worst of it. 3 sections of glass had collapsed inward, and blackberry canes had entered there as if the field had learned the greenhouse's weakness and kept pressing. Clara stood just inside the door and made herself look up first. Roof before floor. That was one of the things her mother had said after a storm took half the awning off the flower shop. If what hung above you was wrong, nothing below you could be trusted. The ridge vent at the peak had sagged open on one side, leaving a long gap where rain had been coming in for years. A few panes were missing entirely, others held by old putty as brittle as pie crust. One triangle of glass near the rear trembled whenever the wind moved. She backed out, found a fallen branch, and used it to push aside leaves instead of walking blindly. Beneath them were clay shards, rusted wire hoops, a cracked watering can, and an old hose that had stiffened into the curve of a sleeping snake. She moved slowly, testing each patch of floor with the branch before setting her weight down. The potting shed door scraped in the wind at the rear corner. Its roof dipped like a tired shoulder, but the small room still held the shape of work. Wooden shelves lined one wall. A sink sat beneath a dirty window. The counter was scarred with rings where pots had been turned and turned again. On a nail beside the door hung a bundle of plant labels tied with twine. Most were blank from weather, but one still showed a faint word in pencil. Violets. Clara held it close to the light. The pencil mark was almost gone, yet the word was unmistakable. She thought of small, purple faces in hospital vases, the kind her mother used to order in winter when customers wanted something living but gentle. Nothing expensive, nothing proud, just a little color for a hard room. A horn sounded outside. Clara turned so fast her boot slipped on wet leaves. Through the broken west glass she saw a white pickup stopped at the lane entrance. The man who stepped out wore a quilted vest over a dress shirt as if he had planned to look practical from the road, but not actually get muddy. He picked his way toward her with a folder tucked under one arm. "Miss Whitcomb," he called. She came out through the greenhouse door, wiping both palms on her jeans. Yes, Grant Leland. He offered a business card instead of a handshake, perhaps, because he had already noticed the mud. "I own the adjoining parcel past the tree line. I heard the county finally found someone to take responsibility for this place. That happened fast. Small towns make bad filing systems and excellent rumor mills." He smiled as if the line had worked before. "I wanted to introduce myself. This structure has been unsafe for a long time. My company has a standing interest in cleaning up Willow Road frontage. If you decide the burden is too much, I can make it simple." "Simple how?" "I buy your interest. You walk away without liability. County gets its eyesore removed." Clara looked past him at the greenhouse. From the lane, it did look like an eyesore, broken glass, mossed brick, black canes in the walls. From inside, she had seen benches waiting under dirt and a pencil mark that had survived decades on a plant label. "I only got here yesterday," she said. "Then you haven't had time to learn what glass disposal costs." He tapped the folder. "Or structural stabilization. Or insurance. I don't mean to be blunt, but these old romantic buildings ruin people who mistake them for opportunities." Clara slid his card into her jacket pocket without reading it. "I'll keep that in mind." He glanced at the red scratch on her wrist, then at her boots. 90 days disappears quickly. So does a greenhouse if no one stands in front of it. The words surprised her. They were not loud, but they were firmer than anything she had said in weeks. Grant gave a polite little nod, the kind that ended a conversation without conceding a thing, and walked back to his truck. By noon, Clara understood one part of his warning. Every small task exposed a larger one. When she cleared leaves from the east bench, water dripped from a cracked pane directly onto the slate. When she shifted a fallen wooden tray, the leg beneath it crumbled into dark meal. When she tried to sweep the brick aisle, the broom caught on a ridge where roots had pushed up from below. She went to town for caution tape and found the hardware store by its hand-painted sign. The man behind the counter had white hair, square glasses, and a pencil tucked behind each ear. "You're the greenhouse woman," he said. "That sounds more established than I feel." "Name's Ives," Helen called. "Said you might need gloves that won't give up in the first hour." He set a pair on the counter. "Pay me when you can." Clara stared at them. "I can pay for one pair. You'll need two eventually. Start with one." He rang it up with a discount he did not mention. When she returned to Willow Road, a dark green truck was parked beside the gate. A man stood near the greenhouse, looking not at the broken door or the weeds, but at the roofline. He had a canvas tool bag in one hand and a child's purple hair tie looped around his wrist. "Clara," he asked. "Jonah Price. Helen said you needed someone to tell you whether this place is trying to kill you." That was generous of her. She said it more politely. Jonah did not step inside right away. He walked the perimeter, first boots sinking into the wet grass, one hand resting lightly on the brick knee wall as if feeling for a pulse. He pointed with a folded ruler toward the west side. "Don't stand under that bay. Those panes aren't seated. Wind could bring them down. I figured the west wall was bad. The west wall is honest about being bad. I'm more interested in what's pretending." He nodded toward the ridge vent. "That hinge line is tired. Temporary bracing before you do much clearing. And you need tarps over the missing panes, but not tight enough to trap moisture. You work on greenhouses. Old windows mostly. Farmhouses, churches, schoolhouses. But wavy glass behaves like wavy glass wherever people put it." He looked through the east wall. Helen said there was a warm pane. Clara led him inside by the safer path she had marked with strips of yellow caution tape. The warmth had faded in the afternoon, but the pane still looked different. Cleaner, less filmed than the glass around it. Clara had taped a scrap of notebook paper to the brick below it and written times down the side. "I touched it yesterday morning," she said. "It was warm. Not sun-warmed exactly, earlier than the others." Jonah crouched near the brick knee wall without touching anything. "Any pipes back here?" "Furnace room at the rear," Helen said. "Old steam lines sometimes run low. Brick can hold heat, but not from nothing." He took a tissue from his pocket, held it near the pane edges, and watched it hang still. Then he moved it to a cracked pane 2 bays over where the tissue fluttered toward the gap. "No draft here. That helps." "Helps what?" "Helps us not be foolish too quickly." He stood and tore 3 clean strips from a roll of blue painter's tape. On each strip, he wrote a number, then placed them on the surrounding panes. "Come before sunrise tomorrow, if you can. Mark condensation. Touch nothing until you've looked at the pattern. If one pane clears, first draw the outline. If it warms, write the time. Use the same hand each time, or use a thermometer if you can borrow one." Clara almost smiled. "That sounds like something a science teacher would assign. My daughter is 8. I've learned that mysteries get less dramatic when you make them hold still on paper." Before he left, Jonah pulled a folded tarp from his truck and handed it to her along with a pair of work gloves still creased from the store. "I bought gloves. Good. Now you have dry ones for tomorrow. I can't pay you today. I didn't bill you today." He said it without softness, which made it easier to accept. Then he showed her how to weigh the tarp with bricks without tying it to weak framing, and he drove away before she could make gratitude awkward. Late afternoon cooled the greenhouse quickly. Clara cleared one more section of the east bench, set the violet label that had warmed under her hand. Beside it, she taped a clean sheet of paper to the brick wall. At the top, she wrote "East window temperatures." Beneath that, she made columns for time, glass condition, air temperature, and notes. The paper curled in the damp, so she smoothed it with her palm and fastened the lower corners with 2 more strips of blue tape. Outside, the road had gone quiet. Inside, water ticked from a cracked pane into an old clay saucer with the patient rhythm of a clock. Clara stood in the aisle until the light thinned, looking at the chart beside the warm window, as if it were a promise she had not yet earned the right to read. Clara reached Willow Road while the sky was still black enough to hold the last stars. She had borrowed an infrared thermometer from Mr. Ives by leaving her driver's license in a cigar box under his counter, though he had waved away the gesture and told her the thermometer was older than some marriages and twice as stubborn. In her other hand, she carried a notebook, a pencil, Jonah's blue painter's tape, and a paper grocery bag to keep everything dry. The greenhouse waited in the field, with no light inside it. The tarp over the west wall moved softly in the wind, lifting and settling against the broken bay. Clara unlocked the gate chain, crossed the wet grass, and stood for a moment outside the east wall until her breath slowed. Yesterday, the place had seemed damaged in 100 directions at once. This morning, before sun and advice and fear could crowd in, it had one question. She did not touch the warm pane. That was harder than she expected. Her hand wanted proof before her mind did. Instead, she clicked on the flashlight and checked the paper chart, still taped to the brick. It had curled at the edges, but the columns held. Time, glass condition, air temperature, notes. Clara wrote 6:04 a.m. Under the first line, then aimed the thermometer at 3 different panes along the east side. 39 degrees, 38, 39. The special pane read 40. Nothing, she whispered. She waited. Waiting had been part of flower work, though customers never paid for that part. They paid for open lilies and roses at the right softness, not for the hours spent moving buckets away from drafts or checking whether hydrangeas had drunk enough to stand through a wedding. Clara leaned against the cold brick knee wall and watched the glass slowly separate itself from darkness. At 6:18, the first gray line of morning came through the firs. Condensation silvered the panes from the inside, each one catching the light in beads. Clara marked them in her notebook, sketching ovals and streaks as best she could. Most of the glass looked the same, damp at the edges, clouded at the center, the old waviness bending the field beyond. At 6:27, the center of the marked pane began to clear. It did not happen quickly. No dramatic circle opened. No hidden lamp shone through. The mist thinned, first in a narrow vertical place no wider than Clara's thumb, then widened toward the lower right corner. She wrote the time, then raised the thermometer. 46 degrees. The panes on either side still read 39. She held a strip of tissue along the left edge, then the right, then the bottom, where the glass met the putty line. The tissue hung limp. No warm draft pushed through. No leak pulled it inward. She moved 2 bays down, where a cracked pane had rattled yesterday, and the tissue trembled immediately toward the break. All right, she said, because the greenhouse seemed to require an answer from someone. By 6:41, the clearing had formed an uneven oval low on the pane and slightly off-center. Clara traced the shape on the outside with blue tape, careful to keep the adhesive on the metal and putty, not the old glass. Then she stepped back. The oval sat directly above the brick knee wall, not in the middle of the window as she had imagined. She crouched. The brick beneath that pane looked like the rest at first. Dark red moss in the mortar hairline cracks where weather had worried the joints. But when the sun moved higher, the lower edge of the warm oval brightened, and a faint amber line appeared between 2 bricks. Clara bent closer until her knees pressed into wet grass. It was not light coming through. It was reflection. Something behind the mortar had caught the sun. She did not dig. She had promised herself that after Jonah's warning. Instead, she took 3 photographs, marked the brick course in her notebook, and tapped gently with the wooden end of her pencil. The first brick gave a dull answer. So did the second. The third, directly under the warmest part of the pane, made a thinner sound. Hollow was too dramatic a word, but it was not the same as the others. Jonah arrived 40 minutes later with a paper cup of coffee for her and a smaller cup of hot chocolate that he admitted he had bought by habit before remembering his daughter was at school. "You can have both," he said. "I may need both." He read her chart with the seriousness of a doctor looking at fever records. Then he crouched where she pointed, tapped the bricks with the handle of his folded ruler, and did not speak for almost a full minute. "That course was repaired," he said at last. "How can you tell? The mortar is close but not the same. See here," he brushed dirt away with 2 fingers. "This joint is sandier. And the brick faces are just a little cleaner, like they were turned inward for years and set back later. Could someone have hidden something there? Someone could have repaired a pipe access badly. Someone could have sealed an old vent. Someone could have hidden something small. We don't know which yet." Clara looked at the pane. The clear oval had started to fog again as the sun rose past its narrow angle. Why would it warm the glass? If there's metal behind the brick, especially copper or darkened flashing, the first sun could heat it faster than the surrounding masonry. Old steam channel below might help hold a little temperature difference. Not heat from power, heat from material and angle. That sounds almost disappointing. Jonah glanced at her. Plausible is kinder than magical. Magical doesn't tell you what to do next. He would not remove anything that morning. The West Bay needed a wider warning zone first, and the loose glass above the aisle made him frown. So Clara spent the late morning working where she could work safely. She filled 2 contractor bags with leaves. She carried broken clay pots to a dry corner of the shed. She lifted the violet label from the brick where she had left it and placed it in a mason jar from her box, because small things survived only when someone stopped treating them as debris. After noon, she drove into Alder Creek with mud on her jeans and the smell of old greenhouse clinging to her jacket. The public library occupied 2 rooms behind the town hall, warm with baseboard heat and the papery scent of tax forms, children's books, and dust. The librarian at the desk had silver hair pinned with a pencil and reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain. "You must be Clara," she said. Clara almost laughed. "Does everyone already know?" "Not everyone. Just the people who answer phones." The woman held out her hand. "Marion Bell." Helen called. Jonah called. Mr. Ives called to ask whether our local history cabinet still had nursery advertisements. "That is more calling than I expected. Old buildings wake up old women." Marion said it dryly without embarrassment and led her to a metal file cabinet near the back window. They searched through folders labeled Agriculture Church, Suppers, Flood Years, and Businesses Closed. Marion moved quickly but never carelessly. She had a way of touching paper at the corners as if each sheet still belonged to the person who had saved it. After 20 minutes, she found a yellowed advertisement clipped from a 1958 county fair program. Vale, Winter Glass House, Forced Violets, Camellias, Memorial Posies, Willow Road, Alder Creek, Miriam Vale Grower. Below the words was a blurred photograph of the greenhouse in better years. The roofline stood straight. The panes shone. In front of the open door, a woman in a dark dress held a flat of small flowers. Her face had been softened by cheap printing, but her posture was unmistakable, upright, unsmiling, proud of work rather than herself. "Miriam Vale," Clara said. "There are more." Marion pulled another clipping, this one from a church bulletin in 1969. "Flowers provided by Vale Glass House in memory of Anna Pike." And here, 1974. "Hospital Auxiliary thanks Miriam Vale and apprentice LCW." Clara's throat tightened before she understood why. She set both hands on the table. "LCW," Marion said gently, "your grandmother. She died before I was born. My mother didn't talk about her much, not in detail. Some families misplace the quiet parts." Clara read the line again, apprentice LCW. The name felt both intimate and unreachable, like seeing a light under a door in a house where no one lived anymore. Her grandmother had stood in that greenhouse. She had perhaps touched the same brick, opened the same warped door, known which panes leaked and which benches held violets best. Clara had inherited no stories about that. Only a name in a county margin, and now this small printed proof. Marion made photocopies without being asked. She also gave Clara a folder, 3 paper clips, and a warning to keep documents away from greenhouse damp. "And if you find anything old," she said, "photograph it before you unfold it too much. People tear history by being excited." Back at Willow Road, the afternoon had turned colder. Clara placed the photocopies in her car before returning to the east wall. The warm pane was ordinary now, clouded and cool. But the brick below it had changed because she had changed. It was no longer just masonry. It was a sentence with part of the middle missing. She knelt and cleared moss from the repaired course, using a wooden plant label not metal. At the edge of the third brick where the sandy mortar had shrunk, something greenish-brown showed in a hairline gap. Clara stopped at once. She should have waited for Jonah. She did wait for nearly 10 seconds, kneeling in the damp with her heart beating in her wrists. Then she used the tip of the wooden label to tease away one crumb of loose mortar. It fell soundlessly into the grass. Behind it, the greenish-brown edge widened. Not paper, not wire. Copper. Clara did not pull hard. She worked only where the mortar had already failed, loosening dirt grain by grain until the object shifted. Then it slid free so suddenly she almost dropped it. It was a plant tag narrow and flat, punched at one end for hanging. Verdigris softened its edges. Soil clung to the stamped letters, and Clara wiped them with the cleanest part of her sleeve. F.E.B., 1974, Violet Bench East. The field went very quiet around her. Wind moved in the broken west wall, lifting the tarp with a low breath. Somewhere beyond the lane, a truck passed and faded. Clara held the tag in both hands because one hand did not feel careful enough. Her grandmother's initials were not in a story. They were not in a margin, not in a photocopy, not in someone else's memory. They were pressed into copper that had been sealed beneath the one warm window of an abandoned greenhouse. The tag was still faintly warm from the brick. Jonah would not touch the brick until he had made the glass above it behave. He arrived with 2 folding sawhorses, a canvas drop cloth, a roll of heavy paper, and the kind of patience Clara had begun to recognize as a tool in itself. Before he came near the east wall, he worked overhead, easing a loose pane from its failing putty and lowering it into a padded crate. "People look at the mystery first," he said, setting the crate against the aisle. "Glass does not care about mystery. It falls when it is ready." Clara held the flashlight while he checked the iron rib above the warm pane. The morning was dry, but cold, and every sound inside the greenhouse seemed sharpened: the scrape of his putty knife, the creak of the ridge vent, the small crumble of mortar, when Clara brushed the brick with a soft paintbrush Marion had lent her. The copper tag waited in a mason jar on the slate bench, its stamped letters facing outward like a witness. Jonah taped heavy paper below the repaired brick course to catch loose grit. Then he pressed 2 fingers against the third brick and tested it gently. "This one is already free on 3 sides," he said. "If it resists, we stop. It feels strange to stop now. That is usually when stopping is most useful." He worked with a narrow pointing tool, not a hammer. Mortar loosened in sandy grains. Clara held a dustpan beneath the joint and watched each small fall as if the greenhouse were measuring how badly she wanted the answer. After 10 minutes, Jonah rocked the brick forward a fraction of an inch. After 15, it slid into his gloved hand. Behind it was darkness no deeper than a shoebox. Clara's breath caught before she could stop it. Jonah angled the flashlight into the cavity. The beam struck the curve of an old copper strip set against the back wall, darkened almost black, except where one edge shone. Above it, tucked lengthwise into the hollow, lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cotton string gone brown with age. "There's your morning warmth," Jonah said quietly. "Sun hits the copper through the glass. Copper warms faster than brick. Brick holds just enough to clear the pane. Whoever sealed this made themselves a little signal. Or a mistake. Sometimes those are the same thing." He did not reach in. Clara did. The cavity was narrow and the brick edge scraped her knuckles as she worked the bundle free. It was lighter than she expected. No weight of coins, no hard box. Just paper cloth and something flat that clicked faintly inside. They carried it to the potting shed because the bench there was dry and the roof above it did not drip. Jonah wiped the surface clean with a rag. Clara untied the cotton string. It broke in the middle and fell apart like old thread from a hem. The oilcloth opened in stiff folds. Inside were 4 seed envelopes, a ledger no larger than a hymn book, and a letter sealed only by being folded into itself. The envelopes were labeled in brown ink: Winter Violet East Bench, Camellia Cutting List, White Stock for Memorials, Save Dry Not Cold. Clara touched only the edges. The paper had softened with years, but the oilcloth had done its work. The writing remained clear enough to feel newly made. The ledger cover was green, faded, nearly gray at the corners. On the first page, in a hand that leaned hard to the right, someone had written, Vale Winter Glasshouse, Kindness Accounts, Miriam Vale Grower, Elsie Whitcomb Apprentice. Clara sat down on an overturned crate because her legs had become unreliable. Jonah looked away not from discomfort, but from courtesy. He busied himself checking the shed window while Clara turned the page with 2 fingers. The entries were not business records in the usual sense. Some lines named flowers and dates. Some named families. Some named no one at all. February 3, 1968. 2 jars violets to Mrs. Pike after stillbirth, no charge. March 19, 1969. Camellia. Stem for hospital room, Ruth C. Child. No charge. November 2, 1971. White stock and cedar for woman leaving bad house. Delivered by Elsie. No charge. January 14, 1974. Winter violets for 3 funerals after mill accident. Hold account open. Clara read until the words blurred. Her flower shop had kept accounts, too. Invoices, refrigeration costs. Late payments, prom orders, weddings canceled, and weddings doubled. She had learned to see flowers through the arithmetic of survival. Here was arithmetic of another kind, a ledger of beauty given when people could least argue that they deserved it. The folded letter was addressed on the outside in the same slanting hand. To Elsie, if I cannot return to the glass before spring. Clara did not open it at first. She placed both palms flat on the potting bench beside it and listened to rain beginning again, thin drops tapping the tarp over the broken west wall. Jonah waited by the door. You don't have to read it with me here, he said. I think I do, Clara answered. If I read it alone, I might make it smaller. The paper sighed when she unfolded it. Miriam Vale's letter did not explain everything. It began with practical things, how to keep violet seed dry, which camellia roots sulked in wet soil, which pipe under the east bench still held a little warmth when morning found the copper backing. Then the writing shifted, not suddenly, but the way a path enters woods before a person notices the field is gone. Miriam wrote that the glasshouse had never been meant as a rich woman's hobby, though rich women had bought flowers there. It had been built by her father from salvaged pains and patience after a freeze killed half the town's orchards. In winter, when fields were brown and houses closed tight against rain, the greenhouse could raise color where people had forgotten to expect it. She wrote that Elsie had understood this without being told. There are women who come to the door with coins counted in their gloves, Miriam had written, and women who come with no coins at all. There are mothers burying children, daughters sitting beside hospital beds, wives carrying bruises under clean sleeves, and old men who do not know how to say they are lonely. We do not ask which ones can pay before we decide whether flowers may comfort them. Clara stopped there. The sentence did not scold. That was the worst and best of it. It simply stood upright like Miriam in the blurred, fair program photograph. The last page mentioned a bank certificate folded elsewhere for safekeeping, and a county note meant to keep the glasshouse from being sold for frontage if any Whitcomb remained willing to continue its use. The details were partially tangled in names Clara did not yet know. Miriam had not written like a lawyer. She had written like a grower, trying to leave instructions before winter closed over the beds. Jonah touched the edge of the ledger. This should be photographed before it travels much. Marion said the same thing. Marion is usually right before the rest of us arrive. They brought the ledger and letter to the library that afternoon in a plastic storage box with a towel beneath them. Marion Bell did not smile when she saw what they had found. She cleared the reading table, washed her hands, and turned on an old desk lamp with a green shade. Oilcloth, she murmured. Bless whoever had sense. She photographed each page. Clara stood beside her holding the lamp, steady when needed, watching the names pass under the light. Some were familiar from Alder Creek mailboxes. Some belonged to streets she had driven without noticing. One made Marion pause. Ruth called her Mary and said, "She still plays piano at the Methodist church when her hands let her. The ledger says hospital room child. Ruth had scarlet fever when she was little." That story survived, but not the greenhouse part. They found Ruth in the church fellowship hall, sorting sheet music into piles. She was 80-something, thin as a dry stem with white hair braided and pinned at the back of her head. When Marion explained, Ruth sat down slowly and took the photocopied ledger page in both hands. "My mother told me there were violets," Ruth said. "I thought she meant on the wallpaper." "No," Clara said. "They were real." Ruth looked toward the tall fellowship hall windows where rain softened the parking lot. "I remember waking up and seeing purple by the bed. I remember thinking someone had brought me a piece of outside." She touched the copied line bearing her childhood initial. "My father had lost work that month. There was no money for flowers." "Miriam wrote no charge," Clara said. Ruth nodded and something like recognition moved through her face. Not surprise exactly, but the closing of a long, open drawer. Then someone was kind and didn't need us to know her name. By evening, Clara returned to the greenhouse with the original ledger wrapped again, though not hidden. Jonah had cut a clean, salvaged pane to fit over the driest section of slate bench. It was not a display case, only a temporary cover, but it protected the pages from the damp air drifting through the cracked walls. Brick reflected a narrow line of evening sky. She rested her fingers on the protective glass, not touching the old paper now, and understood that the mystery had not led to treasure in any ordinary sense. It had led to a debt of tenderness recorded by women who had done quiet work without applause. Some warmth was never meant to belong to one person. The thought came to her in words so plain she knew they were not finished with her. Outside, rain gathered in the broken gutters and fell steadily into the moss. Inside, the ledger waited under the clean pane of salvaged glass, dry for the first time in decades. The next morning, Clara did not begin with flowers. She began with danger. Jonah arrived before 8 with 2 volunteers from the Methodist Church, both retired carpenters who had come because Ruth Calder had asked, and because, as one of them said, old ladies still run this town if you pay attention. They brought hard hats, a stepladder, a box of screws, and 3 sheets of plywood already scarred from other repairs. Clara had wanted to clear the east bench first. The seed envelopes had pulled at her thoughts all night. But Jonah stood in the central aisle and pointed upward. "No one plants under glass that wants to fall," he said. So they marked the unsafe west bay wider than Clara thought necessary. Then the first loose pane slipped when wind pressed the tarp, dropped 6 inches, and cracked against an iron rib without falling. The sound went through the greenhouse like a warning spoken in a language no one needed translated. Clara widened the tape herself. By noon, they had braced the weakest ridge section with temporary lumber-swept glass shards into buckets and laid broken panes flat instead of leaning them where a sleeve could brush them down. Clara learned to carry glass with 2 hands and no pride. She learned that old putty could look solid and surrender at the first patient touch. She learned that a greenhouse was not one broken thing, but 100 small decisions about weight, water, wind, and where a body should never stand. When the volunteers left, one of them touched the brick wall beside the door. "My wife's mother got flowers from here once. I didn't know that until last night." Clara did not know what to say, so she said the truest small thing. "I'll be careful with it." He nodded, satisfied by careful more than confident. The rain came back in March and showed Clara every failure the greenhouse had been hiding. Water ran from the clogged gutters in sheets, struck the brick knee wall, and pooled under the east bench. The old aisle drain was buried beneath leaf mold and roots. When Clara pulled at the mess with gloved hands, the smell rose dark and sour, but underneath it came the clean mineral scent of wet brick waking. Mr. Ives loaned her a trenching shovel with a handle worn smooth by people who had borrowed it before. "Bring it back muddy," he said. "That's how I know it worked." She dug a shallow channel away from the greenhouse, stopping whenever the shovel rang against stone or old pipe. Jonah showed her how the original drainage had followed the slight fall of the land toward a ditch now hidden under blackberry roots. Together they cleared it by inches. Water that had stood stubbornly under the bench began to move first as a tremble, then as a thin brown thread. Clara, crouched beside it, soaked through her knees, watching the thread find its way. In the rear furnace room, they found the inactive heart of the place, a small brick chamber with a cracked, flue-rusted fittings and a low channel where steam pipes had once carried warmth forward beneath the east propagation beds. Nothing about it was ready to use. Some of it might never be used again. But the channel explained the shape of the greenhouse's old intelligence. Miriam had known where warmth traveled. Elsie had known too. Clara cleaned the pipe channel with a brush tied to a length of cord, drawing out flakes of rust dirt and one brittle mouse nest that made Jonah step back and say, "That is all yours. You work with broken churches but fear mice. I respect all opponents with home field advantage." It was the first time Clara laughed inside the greenhouse. The sound startled her, then faded into the dripping roof. That afternoon she wrote drainage moving on her chart beneath the temperature notes. It was not enough for the county. It was not enough for the roof. But water was leaving the place instead of staying to rot it, and that felt like the first honest repair. The potting shed took 3 full days because every object required a decision. Clara sorted ruined from salvageable on an old tarp cracked pots to one side, whole clay pots to another, rusted wire, hoops in a bucket, labels in a mason jar, hand tools in a row on the bench. The sink did not run. The window barely opened. The roof sag made the back corner unsafe, so she cleared only what Jonah had approved and left the rest marked with tape. On the second afternoon, Marion Bell arrived with archival sleeves, a thermos of coffee, and no patience for damp paper. She helped Clara move the ledger and letter into a lidded plastic box that stayed in Clara's car when the weather was bad and returned to the greenhouse only when she was working nearby. "History is not honored by letting it mildew," Marion said. "I thought leaving it here mattered. Returning it here may matter. Storing it in a wet shed does not." Clara accepted the correction because Marion delivered it like weather, not judgment. At the back of a shelf, Clara found a wooden tray divided into narrow rows. The label on the end read, "East Violet Starts," in the same sharp hand as the seed envelopes. Most of the tray had rotted, but one corner remained firm enough to show its construction cedar slats, shallow-depth drainage holes made with a heated nail. It was plain and exact, built for small roots and repeated use. Clara measured it, sketched it, and asked Mr. Ives whether cedar that thin could still be bought. "Bought, yes," he said. "Afforded, maybe not, but I've got offcuts." I gave her a bundle tied with twine and made her take a small packet of brass screws too short for his regular customers. That night, in the rented room she had taken above a closed barber shop, Clara built one imperfect propagation tray on a towel spread across the floor. Her first corner sat crooked. Her second split. The third held. She set the finished tray beside her mother's shears and slept badly, but with sawdust on her sleeve. Glass repair moved slower than hope. Jonah made Clara measure each opening twice, once at the top and once at the bottom, because old frames did not remain square, out of loyalty to anyone's schedule. He taught her to write the measurements directly on painter's tape and stick them to the iron rib beside each gap. He made her feel the difference between glass that could be saved and glass too cracked to trust over a walkway. "You are not restoring a photograph," he said when she sighed over a pane they had to discard. "You are making a building stand in weather." The first salvaged pane Clara helped set was small, no larger than a serving tray. Jonah bedded it in fresh glazing putty while she held it steady, her shoulders aching from the effort of not squeezing too hard. The glass was wavy, pulled from the ruined west section and cleaned with vinegar until the field beyond it bent gently through its surface. "Press here," Jonah said. She did. Putty rose along the edge. Less fear, more even. "I thought fear made people careful. Only at first. After that, it makes them jerky." She breathed out and tried again. They secured the pane with glazier's points, then tooled the putty smooth. Jonah told her it would skin over in days but cure slowly, and that rain dust and impatience were all bad companions. Clara wrote that down. She had once known the timing of flowers by instinct, which roses opened overnight, which lilies needed persuading, which stems bent if left too long in warm water. Now she was learning a new timing, heavier and less forgiving. Grant Leland stopped by near the end of the week. He stood outside the tape line, clean boots planted in wet grass, and looked at the braced roof, the cleared drain, the first patched panes. "You've made it look busier," he said. "I've made it less dangerous. For now." Clara wiped putty from her thumb with a rag. "For now is where repairs start." He offered more money than before. Not a fortune. Enough to pay off the last supplier invoice from her flower shop. Enough to buy several months of sleep without arithmetic. He spoke gently, which was harder to resist than pressure. No one would blame you, he said. Clara looked through the newly set pane. The wavy glass softened the broken interior, but did not hide it. The violet tray sat on the east bench empty and waiting. Beneath the clean salvaged pane, Miriam's ledger lay, protected from damp, its green cover dim in the afternoon light. Grant's face changed slightly. He had expected either anger or gratitude. Her answer gave him neither. After he left, Clara returned to the pane they had set. She ran one finger along the putty line without touching it, feeling the air above the repair rather than the repair itself. It was not pretty yet. The west wall still gaped under tarp. The ridge vent still needed work. The county deadline sat in her notebook like a stone. But one piece of glass held where empty air had been. At sunset, a small crowd of rain clouds broke apart and the east window took the last light. On the bench below it, the imperfect cedar tray waited beside the copper tag marked Violet Bench East. Clara did not trust the old seed envelopes simply because she wanted them to matter. Wanting had ruined enough things already. She took them first to a nursery owner 20 miles away. A woman named Beth Alvarez who kept her gray hair under a baseball cap and could identify mildew by smell before a packet was opened. Beth examined the envelopes beneath a magnifying lamp. "Some may be dead," she said. "I know. Knowing and accepting are cousins, not twins." She taught Clara to test only a few seeds first on damp paper inside a clear container, to label every date to keep them warm but not wet, and to expect nothing quickly. Clara wrote each instruction in the same notebook that held glass measurements and drainage sketches. The pages had begun to wrinkle from greenhouse damp. They looked less like a plan than a life being rebuilt in pencil. The camellia cuttings in Miriam's notes were more complicated. The plants themselves were gone, or so Clara thought, until Ruth Calder sent word of an old shrub behind the church fellowship hall. It had been planted from veil stock decades earlier, Ruth said, and still bloomed pale pink in bad weather. Clara went there with Beth on a cold morning in late March. Beth cut only what the shrub could, explaining nodes, clean blades, rooting hormone, and why hope should never be allowed to masquerade as technique. Clara held the cuttings like fragile permission. Back in the greenhouse, the east bench had been scrubbed, leveled, and lined with Clara's new cedar trays. Jonah had patched enough glass above it to keep out direct rain. Morning sun still found the warm pane, though. Now Clara understood the copper behind the brick and the old pipe channel below it. Knowing the reason did not make it less tender. It made the tenderness usable. She placed the violet seeds in one tray, the camellia cuttings in another, and the white stalk in a third. Each copper label received careful lettering. E.W. had stamped one tag in 1974. Clara wrote CMW 2026. On the new ones, then hesitated, ashamed of how much she wanted her initials to belong beside her grandmother's. Beth saw the pause. "Write the date," she said. "Plants like records more than modesty." So Clara wrote it. Marion and Ruth became guardians of the names. They would not let Clara turn the ledger into town gossip. And Clara was grateful for the rule, because curiosity came easily to people who had not been named in old grief. Marion made a list with 3 columns confirmed uncertain private. Ruth sat beside her at the library table with a cup of tea and corrected family connections in a voice that remained gentle until someone suggested calling around too widely. "No," Ruth said. "If the kindness was quiet, then it can stay quiet now." They found enough to prove the greenhouse had once served a real public purpose. Church bulletins, hospital auxiliary notes, 2 newspaper mentions of Vale winter flowers, a thank you card from 1976 signed only the Miller girls. Marion placed each copy in a folder and made Clara write a short statement for the County Review. Not sentimental, not dramatic, just facts. The greenhouse had documented historic horticultural use. The structure was under active stabilization. The restored East Bench would restart a limited charitable flower program once safe. One evening, Clara reread Miriam's folded letter under the green-shaded library lamp. Near the bottom of the second page, in a line she had passed over because the ink had faded, Miriam had written, Some warmth was never meant to belong to one person. Tell Elsie I trusted her because she already knew. Clara touched the margin beside the sentence. She did not cry. The feeling was older than crying and quieter than relief. Marian looked over her glasses, found something. Yes, Clara said, a sentence that was waiting for me to catch up. Word of the work spread without anyone announcing it. A paper bag of coffee appeared inside the gate. Someone left a stack of old clay pots rinsed and nested. Mr. Ives found more cedar offcuts. Ruth brought a small blue vase and said it could wait on the bench until there were flowers worthy of it. Clara had spent months believing help was proof that she had failed. In the greenhouse, help arrived as material gloves, copied records, dry towels, a working latch, a thermos left beside the door. It did not ask her to perform gratitude. It gave her something to do next. Grant Leland returned in April with a county inspector's card in his shirt pocket and an offer printed on heavier paper than before. The greenhouse had changed enough for him to look annoyed by it. The entrance was clear. The west bay was braced and marked. The east bench held trays under clean glass. The drainage ditch carried rainwater away in a narrow, shining line. You've made progress, he said. Clara was reseating clay pots in the shed doorway. Yes, progress isn't compliance. No, but it's evidence. He looked toward the repaired pane where the copper tag rested beside the new labels. You know my offer would let you settle whatever followed you here. Shop debts, rent, medical bills. I made calls, quietly. Clara set the pot down before she answered. The old Clara, the one who had locked the flower shop door with funeral ribbon in a box, might have mistaken that for rescue. This, Clara heard the hinge hidden inside it. You looked into my debts. I looked into the size of the problem. That was not yours to measure. His face tightened, but he kept his voice level. The county review is in 3 weeks. If they decide this structure is still unsafe, sentiment won't save it. No, Clara said. Work might. The inspection came on a bright, cold morning with 2 county staff members, Helen Armitage, standing slightly behind them, though she was retired, Jonah carrying a folder of repair notes, and Clara wearing the olive jacket now stained with putty soil and honest use. She walked them through the marked path. She did not hide the west wall. She did not pretend the furnace room worked. She showed the bracing, the removed glass, the drainage, the temporary, weatherproofing, and the east propagation bench. The inspector, a woman with steel-toed boots and a practical braid, studied Jonah's notes, then looked at Clara. This is not open to the public. No, you understand that. Yes, not until it's safe. But you are stabilizing, not abandoning. Yes. Helen said nothing, but her hands were clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone pale. The inspector closed the folder. I can recommend extending the demolition hold for continued remediation with documented restrictions. 30 days, then another review. 30 days was not victory. It was not security. It was a narrow plank over water. Clara accepted it with both feet. After they left, Helen touched the greenhouse door frame. Elsie would have liked that you told the truth. I don't know what Elsie liked, no, Helen said. But I know what old files sound like when people lie around them. You didn't. The first violet opened on a Tuesday morning when Clara had come expecting only to check for mildew. It was smaller than she had imagined any important flower could be. One soft, purple face bent slightly toward the warm pane rising from a tray where half the seeds had done nothing, and the other half remained stubborn green promises. The bloom had no trumpet, no grandeur. It simply existed delicate and exact with a yellow throat no wider than a match head. Clara stood very still. The greenhouse was still broken in visible ways. The west wall wore tarps. The ridge vent had only temporary repair. The potting shed smelled of cedar and old damp. But under the east window, where copper and morning sun had once made a secret signal, a living violet had answered months of work with color. She went to her car and brought back Ruth's small blue vase. It was too large for one bloom, so Clara did not cut the flower. Instead, she set the empty vase at the corner of the bench as a promise held in reserve. Jonah arrived with his daughter after school. The girl's name was Willa, and she carried a backpack shaped by too many library books. Clara showed her the violet without lowering her voice into the false sweetness adults used around children. It's the first one, Clara said. Willa leaned close hands behind her back because Jonah had trained her well around glass and seedlings. It's tiny. It is. Is tiny bad? No, Clara said. Tiny is sometimes early. Jonah looked at Clara over his daughter's head, and in his expression she saw the thing he was too careful to say. The greenhouse was not saved yet, but it was no longer only a ruin. It had produced something. That evening, Clara made her first ledger entry on a new page Marian had given her, not in Miriam's book but in a clean continuation binder. April 21, 2026. First violet opened under east window. Not cut. Left growing. She closed the binder and placed it beside the old ledger under the salvaged pane. Outside the field darkened. Inside, the small violet held its color in the last of the light. 3 weeks later, dawn came to Willow Road, clear and mild, with the sky washed pale over the firs and the wet grass silver at the edges. Clara arrived before anyone else, not because there was much left to prepare, but because she wanted to hear the greenhouse before voices filled it. The repaired door opened without scraping now. Jonah had planed the swollen edge and set the latch straight. It still looked old. Clara had asked him not to make it shine. Some scars were part of the record. The central brick aisle had been swept clean. The unsafe west bay remained roped off, but the tarp had been replaced with temporary framed panels that kept out rain and admitted a softened light. Overhead, patched panes caught the morning in uneven squares. The east propagation bench was no longer empty. Violets stood in shallow cedar trays, not many, not enough for a business, but enough to make the air carry that faint green sweetness Clara remembered from winter buckets in her shop. Beside them, camellia cuttings held their leaves under clear covers. White stock seedlings made 2 straight rows in soil dark as coffee grounds. Each tray carried copper labels, old and new, together, the metal warming slowly as the sun climbed. The ledger rested in the potting shed now, inside a sealed archival box Marian had insisted upon. A copy lay beneath the salvaged glass for visitors to see only when Clara chose to show it. The original letter had answered one more question after Marian helped trace the bank certificate mentioned in its final page. It was not a treasure in the way Grant Leland would have understood. It could not buy Clara a house. It could not erase every debt. It was restricted by old language and stubborn intent to the maintenance of horticultural work and charitable flower giving from the greenhouse property. Clara had laughed when the lawyer explained it, a short, tired sound that startled him. "That disappoints you?" he asked. "No," she said. "It sounds exactly like Miriam." The money paid for structural lumber professional glass work, where volunteers had no business risking themselves insurance and the first legal steps of a small community trust. Clara's name would be on the stewardship papers, but not as owner in the hungry sense. The greenhouse would not be sold for frontage. It would not become a boutique venue with string lights hiding rot. It would remain a working glass house, slow and modest, with a ledger that continued the old promise in a form the present could carry. There was no grand reopening. Clara had refused the phrase each time Marian tried it on a flyer. Instead, Marian wrote Willow Road Glasshouse first open morning. No sales. Seed packets welcome. Ruth approved the wording with a pencil check mark. By 8 people began arriving in 2s and 3s. Mr. Ives came with coffee in a metal urn and a cardboard box of mismatched mugs from the hardware store basement. Helen brought a folder of copied documents tied with string, then pretended she had not come early to see whether Clara needed help. Ruth arrived on Jonah's arm, wearing a blue cardigan and carrying the small vase she had lent to the first violet, though it remained empty in her hands. Willa Price came last, running until Jonah cleared his throat, then walking with exaggerated care. Her purple hair tie matched the first bloom, and she looked pleased by the accident. Clara stood by the east bench. She had cut 3 violets that morning after apologizing to the plants, a habit she would have mocked in herself a year ago. One went into Ruth's vase. One went into a jelly jar for the church piano. One lay on the bench beside a card Marian had found among the copied records for rooms where winter feels too long. Ruth held the vase in both hands. The flower looked almost impossibly small against her fingers. "My mother would have known this smell," she said. Clara nodded. "I think Miriam meant people to know they were remembered, even if they never knew by whom." Ruth looked toward the warm pane. That may be the cleanest kind of remembering. Near the door, Helen explained the county extension to a neighbor. Mr. Ives poured coffee. Marion corrected someone who tried to call the greenhouse rescued, saying buildings did not like being spoken of as if they had done no work themselves. Jonah checked the latch twice, then pretended he had only been admiring it. Willa stood by the copper labels, reading them with one finger held above the metal but not touching. Why do some have old initials and some have new ones? Clara crouched beside her. Because more than one person cared for the same bench. Did I make one? Clara took a blank copper tag from a small box and handed Willa a pencil first. Practice the letters on a paper. Copper keeps what you press into it. Willa considered that seriously, as children do when adults accidentally tell the truth. She wrote her name in large uneven letters, then the date. Jonah watched from the aisle with his hands in his pockets, his face turned slightly away. Clara helped Willa stamp the tag slowly. Not hard enough to bend it. Hard enough to last. They hung it on the corner of a tray holding camellia cuttings from the old church shrub, and Willa stepped back as if she had added a beam to the roof. The sun reached the east window then. The familiar oval cleared in the pane, soft at the edges, warm over the brick where the cavity had been sealed again with a small removable cover instead of hidden mortar. Clara had left the copper backing visible only as a narrow line enough to explain the warmth without turning the place into a spectacle. People noticed the clearing glass one by one. Conversation quieted not because anyone believed in magic, but because a thing could be understood and still feel like a mercy. Clara placed her palm near the pane, not quite touching it. Behind her, the greenhouse held the sounds of a living morning coffee poured into mugs. Paper packets shifting, Ruth's low laugh, Jonah telling Willa to watch her elbow near the tray, rainwater moving properly through the cleared drain outside. She thought of the flower shop key leaving her hand. She thought of her mother oiling the brass shears of the roses she had stripped from the window of the first day she had stood here with nothing useful but exhaustion. That life had not vanished. Debt still existed. Grief still came in weather. Some repairs would take years and ask more than she knew how to give. It meant entrusted. Sometimes it meant becoming careful enough to continue. Ruth lifted the blue vase slightly. You should say something. Clara looked at the faces turned toward her. Not a crowd, not an audience, just people gathered inside glass that had almost been lost. She did not make a speech. Miriam had left instructions. Elsie had left initials. Clara could leave a sentence. Some warmth was never meant to belong to one person, she said. No one clapped, and she was grateful. The words settled better without applause. Then she opened both greenhouse doors to Willow Road. Morning air entered carrying the smell of wet grass and fir trees, and the light moved down the brick aisle until it reached the violet bench. The abandoned glass house stood around them with its patched roof, its scarred frames, its small living rows, and its one warm window shining quietly over flowers meant to be given away.